Good evening. It's Wednesday, the 22nd of June, and you're watching Behind the Headlines. I'm Reagan King, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host Simon Barrett. It's good to be back on the program after a hiatus for myself recently. This evening, we're touching on a very interesting and important story. It's been found that Iran has, with a mysterious aircraft, found itself in Venezuela. This aircraft, believing to be carrying perhaps contraband goods of maybe military significance, has now been detained in Argentina, and investigations are underway. This is a concern to security, particularly that of the United States. And the question that we're going to be asking this evening is, should we be concerned about Iran's terror threats? Welcome to the program.
Yeah, it's great to be back on the programme with you. Reagan, feels like a long time since we last did a live Behind the Headlines together. So it's great we can do a programme, particularly on this very, very important topic of Iran's global terror networks and how they pose a direct threat to the West. Just to let you know, we are live, we are interactive tonight, so I'd love to know your views and your opinions. Should we be concerned about Iran's terror threat? Now, we are discussing this very mysterious plane that the Argentinian authorities have detained in Buenos Aires, suspecting it was carrying, I think, 5 members of the banned Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. So the Iranian passenger aircraft, but is actually owned by Venezuela, but its Iranians are actually flying this plane. So it's an Iranian passenger plane being flown by Iranian pilots and having Iranian crew, and also I think 5 members of the IRGC are on board this plane, together with other Venezuelans as well. Now, what's so interesting is that this, over the last month or so, has been doing a kind of around the world trip, flying to Moscow, flying to different places in the world, and it's been picked up, I think, probably by a lot of security agencies around the world who are very, very suspicious of Iran's behaviour. So I think this is a demonstration that Iran is wanting to extend its international terror network as it's racing to build and acquire nuclear weapons. So it's a very precarious time, and with everything going on in the Ukraine and the awful war happening in the Ukraine, the world's attention is off Iran. But I know the Israeli government, we know that the coalition government has collapsed and we're facing elections, but this is a top priority for Israel.
It's extremely significant to reflect for a moment on the stops that this particular aircraft has made. You mentioned Moscow and you mentioned Venezuela. Neither place has a good working relationship at the moment with the United States. Venezuela is very much pro-Iran. Russia is very close with Iran. They're working very closely. If you consider also what's going on at the moment in regard to the Iran deal, the United States is not even allowed to have its own representatives meeting with the Iranians. However, Russia, it's able to function very closely with Iranian officials, which should be a cause for concern. Now, when you have an aircraft like this making stops in nations that are currently under sanctions, heavy sanctions by the West, that are currently at a degree of enmity with, particularly in this case, we think the United States. Venezuela is very, very much in the same hemisphere. It's very much a part of the same network. It's just one continent removed. You can see how Iran is toying with this idea of and actively participating even in participation with enemies of the United States and indeed by proxy the United Kingdom, where we are.
Yeah, they've been doing that for a number of different decades.
Well, 1979 was when we see with the revolution, we see things kick off, and then 1984 since then.
They do have international terror networks around the world,
yeah.
And particularly in South America and Europe, and also in Africa as well. I mean, we see, according to Western security officials, that Iran, under its new president, Ebrahim Raisi, is stepping up oppression against opposition in Iran. We're seeing increasing increasing support for international terrorism abroad, and of course the regime is accelerating its drive towards nuclear weapons, which we covered last week. But the other topic which is really important to bring into this equation as well is that the Iranians have been flying laser-guided missiles into Damascus and also into Beirut to supply the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Syria and also Hezbollah. And of course, this is something that is a red flag to Israel. And this is why last month the Israelis then bombed the Damascus airport in order to prevent the Iranians from actually carrying laser-guided weapons and missiles on board passenger planes on its way to Damascus and Beirut. And you can only imagine what happened a couple of years ago when that horrendous explosion took place in Beirut, of the dangers of what happens if something happens to one of these rockets and missiles. All those passengers on board that plane are going to die. So we are seeing the Iranian regime extending its international terrorism and involvement right now. And also the Daily Telegraph reported recently that the Israeli government has issued a warning to Israelis living in Turkey or visiting Turkey that the Iranian regime is looking to carry out terrorist attacks against them. So this is why we're talking about something that is very pressing, something that's very urgent, and something the world needs to wake up to.
Washington is keeping close tabs on this particular case. Israel has praised Argentina for its proactivity in identifying a potential threat. And just to clarify, viewers may think, well, okay, yeah, they definitely have pilots, they definitely have people skilled in this. What's the big deal? Let's unpack a little bit of the background of these individuals on this aircraft, shall we? First of all, Mahan Airlines is described as the favorite airline of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It's been used to haul weapons, ammunition, and mercenary forces from Iran, Iraq, and neighboring countries to Syria, to support Bashar al-Assad, according to the NCRI. Now, Venezuela and Iran, I've already said, are known allies. And Conviasa was sanctioned by the U.S. in 2020, accused of using its airline for political reasons. There have been claims that one of the detained Iranians is Gholamreza Qasimi, who is a former commander. This isn't just a private, this is a former commander of the IRGC force who has been implicated in smuggling weapons to Lebanon's Hezbollah in recent years. Later reports have claimed just the name matched. That is possible, but it is an interesting coincidence if this is what's being claimed. Now, another held crew member is allegedly a family member of Ahmed Vahidi, Iran's interior minister, who, along with Mohsen Razi and Ali Falehan, is wanted by Interpol for his role in the 1994 bombing of the Jewish Community Center of Buenos Aires, incidentally the place where this plane is also being held. The devastating bomb blast killed at least 85 people and injured 300 others, destroying a 7-story Jewish community communication center. Now, Abedini, who himself survived a terror attack by the IRGC 30 years ago, said, "We know that Mahan Air is the favorite airline of the IRGC for illicit activities, particularly transporting troops, weapons, and all sorts of things." So there's a lot going on here that I think does point to a valid suspicion of threat that needs to be taken seriously.
Absolutely, and I think the Argentinian authorities need to be congratulated, because they haven't necessarily cooperated when it comes to terrorism before on their soil. We also saw that there was an Iranian terrorist attack on the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in '92, and of course now those people that survived that horrendous terrorist attack in '94 in Buenos Aires, and also those who had loved ones murdered in that terrorist attack, are still seeking justice. So the fact that the members, the IRGC members that are on board this plane, could be arrested by Interpol and actually arrested for crimes against humanity, against committing acts of terrorism on the soil, because we know that previous Argentinian governments have covered this up. particularly the last time it went to court back in 2014. So I think this is a highly significant move and a move that should be welcomed by the international community, and the Argentinian government has done very well regarding this.
They have, and it all is part of this increasing encroachment in the Western Hemisphere. Iran is seeking to spread its talents, if you will, throughout the world, and it has succeeded in infiltrating a great deal of the Western Hemisphere with various proxy armies and whatnot. We do have some emails and text messages. Reminder, we're live and interactive, and we are asking the question, should the West be aware of, should we be concerned about Iran's terror threats? That's the question this evening. So feel free to tune in. Please do send your thoughts on answering this. We have from Dory already. Hi guys, just watched Amir Safarti breaking news on YouTube. So close to war with Iran, just a couple of weeks away from getting the bomb. We had this conversation a few months ago. I believe one of our guests suggested at that time it was about 10 weeks away. We're now probably 20 weeks after, so we're very, very close. In any case, it's quite scary. Also sad news, Nancy from Nancy's Farm has died. Wonderful woman, great supporter of Israel.
Yeah, amazing woman. I mentioned her last week. She's an incredible woman. And, gave up a home and a farm for pro-Israel speakers, had a real heart for Holocaust survivors, and had a passion and love for Israel. So she'll be very much missed.
And Dory says that she spent many happy hours with her and met up with you, Simon, at
yeah, absolutely.
the farm. So what a blessing.
Once or twice a year, go down to Newport, just outside Cardiff, and have a speaking engagement with a beautiful farm and its grounds, and a really nice lake as well. So
beautiful. May God comfort her family.
Absolutely.
Judith says, good evening, friends. No apologies for going off topic after a horrendous day when my clutch died in the middle of Pontefract. I hope you get that sorted. Reagan, you're a sight for sore eyes. Welcome back. It's good to be back. Thank you very much, Judith, for that kind message.
Right, now what's so interesting is this plane. So this mysterious plane was a Boeing 747 Dreamliner, registered to the Venezuelan airline, Enstar, but was owned by Iran. Landed in Argentina on the 6th of June. It tried to leave 2 days later, but after Uruguay, Paraguay and possibly Brazil denied entry to their airspace, it eventually returned to Argentina, and since then has been held in Buenos Aires airport. Now this is what they say. Information was received through different channels from foreign organizations warning that members of the crew belong to companies connected to Quds Force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. The Argentinian defense minister said this. Now, it's so interesting, isn't it, that even says here that Buenos Aires is under pressure from America, Israel, and several of its neighbors to investigate the plane. Its seemingly benign cargo included cigarette cartons suspected of being a cover for terrorist recruitment activities, as the crew consisted of 7 Iranian nationals. 11 Venezuelans seemed to care little about loading or unloading the merchandise on the airport. So, I mean, literally, this plane has been everywhere. It's been to West Africa, Russia, Pakistan, Hong Kong, Nicaragua, Cuba. Other stops included Tehran, the capital of Venezuela, is it Caracas, and other places. And
all havens of democracy.
Oh, absolutely. Crime place, tri-state area between Paraguay, Argentina and Brazil, which is one of the most dangerous areas of the whole world. But also something as well that the Iranian regime has also got involved in narcotics, you know, actually working alongside the drug cartels in South America as a way of funding terrorism. So what they did in the early 2000s was that they would train the drug lords and others in Colombia in military warfare, and in return they'd have cheap drugs and get cocaine and then flush it on the market, and this would fund their kind of terror activities around the world. So when you see crime and criminal activity, you know, with terrorism, it goes hand in hand.
And also, This is a strategy, this is a tactic that's been used particularly in the past century by armies with nefarious purposes to spread drugs, to try to get to a point of proliferation, particularly among the opposing armies, primarily Western armies, in such a way that it disgraces and brings shame to those armies and destabilizes societies. You can look at the drug trade, you can look at the proliferation of crime that's related to that, and you have to say, with such proliferation in our society, we're increasingly unstable. We're even talking about declassifying drugs in some cases, wherein any sense of law and order is lost, where these things become mainstream. Can you imagine? I mean, this would be a dream for the IRGC, this would be a dream for any enemy army, because with proliferation and easy access, they're not partaking. They can, at some point, bide their time and, in their thinking perhaps, make a move. Now, it's important to recognize that while we are in many ways considering a lot of stuff that's unknown, we don't know where things are going to go with this bomb. We don't exactly know the stage of development. There have been speculations. We know it's very close to being fully developed. We can't afford to be complacent. And that's why we keep having these programs. That's why we keep having interviews with individuals talking about it on the basis of their expertise. Now, Dork Gold in The Telegraph wrote an article, "The West cannot afford to be complacent about the Iranian threat." And he says this: "Today, even before it perfects a deliverable nuclear weapon, Iran is already altering the balance of power in the region, as demonstrated by the January 2020 Iranian attack against U.S. troops at the Ain al-Assad air base in western Iraq that left 110 American servicemen with brain injuries. Iranian proxy forces such as Yemen's Houthi movement have unleashed repeated strikes in the last 3 years at the heart of the Saudi capital, Riyadh, using ballistic missiles and drones, a conflict, I might add, that we hear very little about, precious little about, though it is extremely significant in Iran's attempts at altering this balance of power." The outgoing commander of the U.S. Central Command, General Kenneth McKenzie, issued a statement in mid-March saying Iran now has 3,000 ballistic missiles. He's argued that these have become the greatest threat to Middle Eastern security. And moreover, Iran's proxy, Hezbollah, has acquired nearly 150,000 rockets. According to one British study, after 2015, the number of Shia militias rapidly increased, the Middle East becoming far more dangerous as a result. So when you consider all of this balance of power and you consider the shaking of it, you can then look and see this has been brewing. Iran's been building up to this since 1979, essentially, aiming to establish a global caliphate.
Absolutely, but first they want to establish the what's known as the Shia Crescent and completely change the balance of power in the Middle East, because before it's always dominated by Sunni nations, but they want a Shia domination. So they want to go from Tehran all the way to Jerusalem and conquer Jerusalem. And that's their aim. That's what they're looking to achieve. And of course, the Iraq war helped in that. But I think it's also important to bring into the argument that as we did a program, wasn't that long ago, a few months ago, Reagan, looking at the proposed Iran deal that the Biden administration were offering the Iranians to not halt, but reduce the production of their nuclear weapons program. And part of that agreement was that the American government would describe the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. And I think what we're seeing from this program tonight, and we'll unpack a lot more evidence, that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards is a massive globalist, state-sponsored terror organization and is the terror arm of the Iranian regime that trains Hamas against Israel, trains Hezbollah against Israel and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, fights in Yemen. It supports the Shiites in Yemen, fighting against the against the Sunnis there, and is pretty much in Iraq and also very much involved in Syria, with about 80,000 Iranian troops and militias under its control, only 50 miles from Israel's border. So let's have a look at these two very important and significant news items. The first is from the IDF, that looks at the Iran-Hezbollah axis, together with concerns about the Iranian Revolutionary Guards reported by CBN.
Terrorism, the systematic use of violence and intimidation against civilians. The motive, Islamist fundamentalism, radical extremists inciting against Western countries, among them Israel. Who's behind the recent wave of terror?
At least 3 Iranians were inside at the time of the first, apparently accidental explosion.
New Delhi police have conclusively linked last month's Israeli embassy bombing to Iranian secret agents.
Bomb attack that last year killed 5 Israeli tourists.
Evidence points to one perpetrator. Iran is the main player in orchestrating recent acts of terror. But it's not alone. Hezbollah, a terror organization in southern Lebanon, is playing to Iran's tune. In 2009, the Israeli Navy intercepted 500 tons of weapons aboard the MV Frankop, all Iranian-made and intended for Hezbollah. Iran not only arms terror organizations, it also trains them. Terrorist operatives flock to learn from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which trains them in guerrilla warfare, tunnel digging, and concealing traps. Apart from a worldwide guerrilla war, Iran is striving to achieve a nuclear arsenal with blatant disregard for UN Security Council demands. The bottom line is indisputable. Jihadist terror is a worldwide problem. It's your problem. Act now.
After months of talks, the U.S. pursuit of this agreement could mean removing Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard from the list of foreign terrorist organizations. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett calls the potential concession dangerous because it involves the world's deadliest terror organization.
The terrorist group, the IRGC, is trying to murder Israelis and certain Americans around the globe. Unfortunately, we're seeing a determination to sign a nuclear deal at almost any cost, including saying that the biggest terrorist group in the world is not a terrorist organization. This is too steep a price.
They have become the operational terrorist arm of the Iranian government, which employs terrorism as a tool of statehood. And that's why we actually designated the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization.
Former Deputy National Security Advisor for the Middle East, Victoria Coates, sees the IRGC as a menace to the region. As part of the Trump administration, she helped designate the group as a foreign terrorist organization, or FTO.
What was powerful about the FTO for the IRGC, which was groundbreaking, it was historic, we hadn't done that to a military before, is it immediately stopped a lot of the IRGC's commercial activities, which were one of the economic lifelines to the regime in Tehran.
Coates says the Revolutionary Guard resembles a cancer, spreading terror through the region and using proxies like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, plus international assassination threats. It's also behind Iran's ballistic missile program and its drone arsenal. Any U.S. agreement to remove the IRGC from the terrorist list would supposedly require a promise not to spread terror in the region. Coates points out, after the Biden administration lifted the designation off the Houthis in Yemen, they simply increased terror activities.
So interestingly, as Israel has gotten closer to both Saudi and UAE, they've been talking about this and what happened when the Houthi came off the list and how terrible it's going to be if the IRGC comes off the list. They'll get a lot of money. They'll have freedom of movement again. And we've seen almost for the first time in my memory, a united message out of Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, and Jerusalem that this is unacceptable. And these are 3 of the United States' most powerful allies in the region. We should listen to them.
CBN News, Jerusalem.
We have some emails here. This is from Joyce. Hi, Simon and Reagan. Yes, we need to keep our eyes and ears open and be alert as to what Iran is up to. God protect us all and give us wisdom and discernment. Indeed, we can look in the scriptures and we see that Iran does have a role in the end times, a very significant role in end-time prophecy. So as we are even talking about this, we should be considering what the scriptures have to say in that regard. Thank you for your email, Joyce. Cole says, good evening, all at Revelation TV. Yes, we should be interested in what's going on. However, we should always remember that Jesus already has the victory. Just a thought about the plane. Iran may not have a nuclear bomb, but they have the materials to make dirty bombs. God bless you all. Call. Now, one of the things, Call, consistently, it appears that Iran does have a nuclear bomb. They certainly have the wherewithal for it, and they may not have it immediately to hand, but we've heard, as I already said some months ago, that they were only a matter of weeks away from having it fully developed. We're past that. They've clearly not used it. We thank God for that. But at the same time, all of the intel seems to be pointing to either they have it or they almost have it.
I think the big question is, and I met a security expert quite a few years ago, who told me that I discussed the issue with the Iranian nuclear issue, because this is something that's been around for more than 2 decades, and it's been a big foreign policy issue. And he says that it's not until they actually test a weapon do you actually know they've got it. So until they actually test a nuclear weapon, that's when you know they've got it, because they can't do anything until they test it. So what we're seeing now is that the Iranian regime is stepping up and accelerating its bid to acquire nuclear weapons. And also the other thing we have to link this to is its ballistic missile program. So the fact is, you get a nuclear warhead, you put that nuclear bomb onto one of these missiles, it can strike anywhere in the Middle East, it can strike anywhere in Europe and even the United States as well. Or they cozy up to Venezuela and supply these rockets and missiles to Venezuela and fire, and then Florida and the south coast of the United States comes under their range and missile attacks. So this is a very, very serious concern. Now, the one thing you have to ask yourself in this whole kind of situation, particularly where we are economically, now, if the Iranian regime had accepted this unbelievably generous but also foolish and dangerous offer to re-enter into the Iranian nuclear agreement, yes, they probably would have delayed their requirement of these nuclear weapons, but also that means that they would have $100 billion in US sanctions relief, would have made an extra, maybe even $100 billion money out of selling oil and natural gas because of the oil crisis, which then they could further then fund international terrorism around the world to a level that we've never even seen before. But there's something in the regime which they know is at breaking point. They know that the people are not with them. And so therefore their ultimate objective, what they think, is to acquire nuclear weapons. If they get their hands on the world's most dangerous weapon, then this will secure their regime, and they can step up their attacks, international terrorism, particularly Israel, without any fear of retaliation, or worse, with the Hochateers in power, the crazy end-time apocalyptic mullahs, think that they could press the nuclear button, fire it at Israel, and will trigger an Armageddon to bring back the 12th Imam or the Islamic Shia Messiah. So whichever way, they think this is absolutely essential to bringing back the 12th Imam.
We have an email here from Anita with some insight. It's great to have you both together again. Always lovely to see you both. In one article online, they stated that in 2020, the State Department estimated Iran gave Hezbollah $700 million a year. In the past, Tehran had historically given $100 million annually to Palestinian groups, including Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They fund and encourage terrorism, and now they want nuclear weapons. We should be concerned. We need to be praying and looking to our Savior now more than ever. And as always, you include a scripture. I always like that, Anita, Psalm 34:14. Turn away from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. And indeed, we should be praying towards that end. Now, there is an impact, there is effect that this will have, as you've already said, globally. It will have impact in the UK as well. We'll be talking more about that when we come back from this interview that I was able to conduct earlier with our friend from The Watchman, Eric Steckelbeck.
Thank you, Eric, for joining us this evening for Behind the Headlines. It's a privilege to have you on the show once more, and I'm sure that this will be very insightful for our viewers.
Thanks, Reagan. Always great to be here.
Now, we've been discussing a little bit, we've discussed this so many times on Behind the Headlines. Iran is a massive sponsor of terrorism around the globe. And there's this very troubling story that's been in the news recently, even in mainstream outlets, concerning an aircraft that is now being held up, I believe, in Buenos Aires, that has given cause for concern. What exactly is going on with this story?
Yeah.
Will it affect U.S. security in some way? What do you think?
Yeah. Reagan, I'm so glad you brought this up. First of all, as an American, I live in the United States. Of course, you mentioned U.S. security. This is at our southern doorstep. Venezuela is in our hemisphere. It's in South America, of course. And this is indicative of Iran's growing presence in Latin America. Now, as you said, this plane is held up in Argentina, but it was apparently on its way to Venezuela. And reportedly, some members of Iran's Quds force may have been on board this plane. And who knows, Reagan, what they were shipping to Venezuela? Could it have been weapons for the regime of the dictator there, Nicolas Maduro? I think that's a very good bet. Their relationship, Iran-Venezuela, is growing. As a matter of fact, just last week, a few days ago, they signed a 20-year agreement where they will be cooperating across a variety of fronts, economic, of course, energy, and you have to think weapons and military hardware could be part of this dangerous agreement between Venezuela and Iran. So it's unclear what exactly is on board that ship, but some very nasty players were on board from Iran, and who knows, perhaps even weapons.
5 Iranians were on the plane, I believe, who were attached directly to the Quds force. The claim so far has been made that no arms were found, but we don't know if this is after the arms were delivered. It definitely, if you look at the route of travel, seems as though something shady has been going on. Russia also fits into this.
Yes.
There's been this ongoing deal that the U.S. is involved in, featuring Russia, featuring Iran and various others trying to negotiate. Tell us a little bit about how that plays in to this scenario.
Well, with the Iran nuclear deal, Reagan, I believe you're referring to, this is very interesting that in Vienna, in these nuclear talks between Iran and world powers, the United States is part of those talks, but only indirectly. On Iran's demand, U.S. negotiators have not been allowed in the room with their Iranian counterparts. What Iran has said is that we want Russia to be the intermediary. So we have this strange situation where the U.S. is condemning Russia, obviously, over the Ukraine invasion, major tensions between the United States and Russia right now. And yet the United States is literally farming out the Iran deal negotiations to Russia. They're playing the mediator role between Iran and the U.S. And Reagan, needless to say, I don't think the regime of Vladimir Putin can be trusted when it comes to this. And the requirement, one of the requirements from Russia is that, hey, we need to be able to do business with Iran. No matter what happens, we can't have our business and military cooperation with the Iranian regime affected in any way. And it has not been. Russia and Iran, to me, Reagan, only seem to be coming closer together. Remember, Vladimir Putin, in the wake of that invasion of Ukraine in February, he was isolated on the world stage. Countries abandoned their relationships with Russia, but Iran has stood solidly by his side. And we're at a point now where Russia truly needs allies, and Iran and the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, Venezuela as well, they have all stood behind Vladimir Putin, and he does not forget that.
Absolutely. Now, we've talked a little bit about Venezuela, and of course, we do need to say Venezuela is an ally, that they are a known ally of Iran. We've talked about Russia, and we see that alliance, you say it's growing. It appears to be closer than ever, would you say?
I would say, Reagan, absolutely. I think now, too, I think you're going to see it again become even closer, because Russia looks across the world landscape, and there's few regimes that have still stood by Putin, and Iran is one of them. The relationship, I would have said in the past, is much more important to Iran. But now you have to think it's becoming more important to Russia as well, because, again, they need friends, and Iran has stood solidly behind them. You have Iran, Venezuela, Syria, China, North Korea. These are the players, rogue regimes, one and all, who are standing behind Vladimir Putin. So what I think you have, Reagan, right now, I call it the gathering storm, this anti-Western, anti-Israel bloc. Russia and China, the most powerful players in it, but working hand in glove in many instances with the Iranian regime, with North Korea, with the likes of Venezuela. They have differing ideologies in many cases, but they are all united in their hatred of the United States, Israel, the West. So strange bedfellows, but definitely a very dangerous and growing bloc. It has echoes, to my mind, Reagan, of 1939 and the run up to World War II.
Okay, so since 1979, Iran has actively participated in sponsoring terror groups. It's been designated as a state sponsor of terror and terrorist groups since 1984. You just mentioned not only are they a threat to the United States, but also Israel. And this brings us to one of their primary proxy groups, I guess you could say, that they sponsor, Hezbollah. Tell us a little bit about their transfer of weapons to Hezbollah and how the U.S. at the moment is viewing this scenario, this situation. Biden, what is his approach to Israel in all of this?
Well, I'll take the first part first, Reagan. Big story here. These Iranian weapon shipments to Hezbollah via Damascus. This could, I don't exaggerate, this could be the spark to the next Middle East war. Perhaps even before Iran's nuclear facilities, a possible Israeli strike there, this could lead to a major conflict. Israel is determined to stop those Iranian weapon shipments. How they're doing it, Reagan, is many times, even on civilian flights, the Iranian regime is flying advanced weapons parts into Damascus International Airport in Syria. Those weapons parts are then stored in a warehouse and then taken to Lebanon overland in trucks into the hands of Hezbollah, which, as you mentioned, is Iran's most lethal proxy. Now, what are these weapons? The most lethal of them are precision-guided missiles, PGMs for short. What Iran does is they ship the parts for these PGMs through Syria, then Hezbollah can assemble them later on in Lebanon. Why are the PGMs a game changer? They do exactly what their name says. They are designed to hit targets in Israel with precision and accuracy. That is a red line Israel won't allow Iran to cross. And that is why we've seen hundreds of Israeli airstrikes in Syria over the past few years, including the recent shutdown of Damascus International Airport due to Israeli airstrikes. Israel finally said, hey, we can't allow you to continue to transport weapons through this airport that will be used against Israel. So Israel bombed the runway of Damascus International Airport. It is apparently about to reopen, by the way. They've been doing repairs on it. But speaking of Russia, Reagan, one quick point to make. Russia was none too happy about this. They have condemned Israel over these airstrikes against Damascus International Airport. And I see tensions between Russia and Israel really increasing. And that's another reason I believe Russia and Iran are coming closer together. Iran is saying to Russia, hey, are you going to allow this? There are thousands of Russian troops in Syria right now, and they've been kind of standing by and watching Israel conduct these airstrikes. And Iran is saying, hey, I thought you were our ally. You're the big boy on the block, so to speak. You need to step in and rein in the Zionist entity. I think we're going to see more of that in the days to come. Very precarious situation.
War, rumors of war.
Yes.
And particularly involving Russia, Iran, and Israel. I mean, these are all extremely biblical themes. Now, we have this doomsday clock, which is at the moment, since 2020, 100 seconds to midnight. It's said to forecast, the danger of imminence of nuclear war. How close do you think we are to nuclear war? And do you believe that the Middle East is probably going to be where we see this happening, particularly in regard to Iran?
Well, I would hope and pray, Reagan, that we'd never see a nuclear war, but I can't say that's a guarantee. The way things are going, how close are we to war? Just a conventional war? I believe in the Middle East, we're very close between Iran and Israel. Would nuclear weapons be used there? I know Israel wouldn't use them first, for sure, but here's the sticking point. The Iranian regime is hell-bent on acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, I don't believe they're going to get there. And I believe that is because Israel will carry out a preemptive strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. If Iran got the bomb, God forbid, then you're much closer to a nuclear exchange. But I don't think we'll get there because I think Israel will act first. And imagine, Reagan, if Iran did acquire the bomb, what that would do to the region. There would be a nuclear arms race in the world's most chaotic region, the Middle East. Everyone would be vying to get the bomb. So the Middle East, absolute tinderbox. I think you will see a conventional war there, probably sooner rather than later. I can't set an exact timetable, but things are certainly trending in that direction. But on the nuclear front, Reagan, you make a great point here about nuclear war. I know people at home might say nuclear war, that sounds crazy. Well, let me tell you, not only is Iran driving for the bomb, North Korea has the bomb. That's obviously an unpredictable regime. They're doing intercontinental ballistic missile tests on a pretty regular basis. Now, then you have Russia on a practically weekly basis. Vladimir Putin and other Russian leaders are threatening to use nuclear weapons, not only in Ukraine, but against the West. This is something that must be taken seriously. And lastly, China is in the midst right now of a massive nuclear buildup. So, Reagan, you make a good point to bring this up. I think people need to start being, here in the West especially, need to start being very aware of the real possibility that some rogue regime could use the world's deadliest weapons. I think we're closer now than maybe we have been since World War II, certainly since the Cold War.
You mentioned a preemptive strike. How do you believe the West will respond to such a preemptive strike if carried out by Israel on Iran, particularly given Biden's rather frosty approach to the previous Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, instability in the Knesset with yet another election on the horizon? Yeah. What do you think the relationship will be going forward?
Mm-hmm. With the Biden administration, I can't say, based on what I've seen so far, Reagan, I can't say that I believe they will stand staunchly behind Israel. We'll put it that way. The world, number one, will howl when this war comes. And look, it's going to involve civilian casualties on both sides, sadly. But Israel has made clear to the government of Lebanon, hey, you're essentially hosting Hezbollah. And we need to eliminate, in the next war, Israel needs to decisively eliminate Hezbollah as a threat. And I think that's going to happen, and perhaps Hamas and Gaza as well. But the main thing here to remember is this is going to be a nasty, bloody, violent affair. And I hate to say it, I know that's not pleasant for people to hear, but when you talk to Israeli officials, certainly when you hear the rhetoric coming out of Iran and Hezbollah, Hamas, the next war is going to be ugly. Let's just say that it's going to be nasty. There will be images of civilian casualties. And like I said, on both sides, but the world will probably howl and condemn Israel, you would think, depending on how this thing all starts. Certainly, if Israel strikes Iran's nuclear facilities, much of the world will condemn Israel. The U.S. is the wild card. Obviously, under President Biden, I don't have a lot of confidence that they would stand staunchly behind Israel. Remember, Biden, for all the talk that he kind of puts forth about being a great friend of Israel, He was the vice president under Barack Obama, who was, to my mind, the most anti-Israel president in American history. So I'm not very confident of a strong U.S. support system for Israel. But biblically, that's not surprising, Reagan. The Bible talks about a day when Israel will be isolated among the nations, but God is with Israel.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Eric. Much to watch and pray for in regard to this ongoing powder keg that's in Iran. We pray that God would continue to bless you as you bring these important insights. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Reagan. God bless.
Well, we're very thankful to Eric for that very helpful comment on this situation. Now,
before we do that, also to our viewers as well, that you can go to The Watchman on YouTube, and Eric does excellent reports on Israel and the Middle East, including amazing archaeological discoveries in Israel as well. So definitely worth checking out.
Highly recommend those. Those are the best, the archaeological discoveries. Digress. The Iranian terror threat to the UK. We might be looking, we've talked a little bit about the US, but terrorists linked to Iran were caught stockpiling tons of explosive materials in a bomb factory on the outskirts of London as recently as, I believe, 2020, there was some action.
And
but
2015.
2015. Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group, which is backed by Iran, was behind the plot foiled by MI5 and counter-terror police in 2015. Intelligence sources stressed that the raid successfully disrupted any imminent threat posed by Tehran and its satellite organizations, but units still operate across Europe, and it's possible Iran could activate a cell in the UK in retaliation for any support to the US.
I suppose the other danger as well is actually cyber attacks now, and the Iranian regime is very much involved in cyber attacks. According to the same article in The Telegraph, it says that GCHQ has stepped up its monitoring of the Tehran-backed hackers over fears of retaliatory attack using cyber warfare. Iran has been blamed for hacking of number of MPs and peers' emails accounts back in 2017, an attack on the post office, local government networks, private sector companies at the end of 2018, and also saying they're responsible and they are linked to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Iran has built up its cyber arsenal over the course of the past decade, following an attack on its nuclear facility in the city of Natanz. Iran claims to have trained up to 120,000 volunteers in cyber warfare, led by the Basijis, a paramilitary network of volunteers linked to the Iranian regime. So, you know, it's not only these issues that are causing effect and harm, but using any other weapon that they can, whether it's terrorism, whether it's cyber attacks, whether he's even developing kind of nuclear weapons. We know that Iran wants to dominate the world and bring about the return of the 12th Imam or the Islamic Shia Messiah.
Wherever you look,
their theological aims and objectives.
And wherever you look in regard to conflict, particularly that the West is involved, you often see Iran is not too far away in regards to its activity with those nations that are either enemy nations very openly or that we are currently experiencing estrangement from. We've talked about Russia, we've talked a little bit about Venezuela, we've talked about what's going on in Yemen very briefly. We can also consider, as Eric spoke about, ongoing tensions, ongoing issues in Syria. One very recent story, an unusual surface-to-surface missile attack targeting Damascus International Airport, was attributed to Israel and was successful in damaging some runways, preventing large cargo planes from landing at the airport. Now, this is significant because Iran, up to that point, was landing cargo planes to deliver systems equipped with guidance technology for upgrading existing missiles for precision-guided missiles. So you can consider how Israel has, without directly attacking any base in Iran, it's already showing its willingness to carry out a preemptive strike.
No, absolutely. And of course, and you sadly weren't on Behind Headlines last week. So what we discuss is the massive military drills that the Israeli government have been carried out last month in preparation for a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear facility. So the biggest, including 100 Israeli aircraft over a distance of 1,000 miles to actually train for a potential attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, as well as training in Cyprus to deal with the conditions of what it would be like to take on Hezbollah again, because there would be no doubt that if Iran takes out Iran's nuclear facilities, there'll be a massive retaliation. And the fear is then that Iran's proxies in Hezbollah will fire their rockets and missiles. They have something like 140 to 180,000 rockets and missiles in southern Lebanon. Will fire them at Israel, and so will Hamas in Gaza as well. So the situation we're facing now is extremely precarious, and this has all pretty much come about because the complete change of policy of President Biden to engage with the Iranian regime, to embolden and empower the Iranian regime as the focal point of American foreign policy to the region, which has endangered Israel and our allies as well. And plus also we saw the disastrous US withdrawal from Afghanistan, sent a message to Tehran that the United States is a paper tiger. This is pretty much why Putin thought that he could then invade the Ukraine without any fear of NATO retaliation. And that's exactly what's happening. So what we're seeing really is the fragmentation of the international order because of America's weak leadership. And already seeing now in the Middle East, because America is no longer an influential power anymore in the region, and also the fact that the Russians now have lost also, is it 50,000 men in the war in Russia, that the Arab states are no longer trusting Russia as the big horse in the Middle East. And this is why they're turning to Israel, and this is why the Abraham Accords are getting stronger. So the next big move really will be the announcement of Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Israel, primarily because of the Iranian threat and the Iranian nuclear threat. So we can see that things are changing very, very fast, but also incredibly precarious. That's why we need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem at this precarious time.
The lines are being clearly drawn. You do see that increasing alliance between Israel and various Sunni states. As you mentioned, Saudi Arabia involved in that. Janet says, dear chaps, don't you think that all this terrorism becoming global is the enemy and the hidden globalists getting the world ready to cry out for a global leader and false savior? We must always look behind the scenes at who is really orchestrating all of this.
Well, when it comes to terrorism, particularly Islamic terrorism, there's only one finger you can really point to, and that's the Iranian regime. You know, we also got to remember that a lot of the American hardware, military hardware worth billions and billions of US dollars, ended up not in the hands of the Taliban, because the Taliban ended up giving that to the Iranians. So all this latest high-tech military technology, the Iranians have got. You know, they're developing drone attacks as well. So, you know, it's easy to say that these so-called globalists or people behind the scenes are pulling these strings, but when it comes to this issue of terrorism and Islamic terrorism and the spread of Iran's terror networks, the Iranian regime itself is spreading this. And that's what we've got to be clear about.
And personally, Janet, I think we have to consider with the coming of the Antichrist, who you refer to, is there will be a range of circumstances across the world that lead to this. It's not all going to be about the globalists. It's not all going to be the responsibility of the globalists. There will be many factors at play that lead up to this point. Now, of course, underlying it all is our primary adversary, our primary enemy. And as I believe Carl said earlier, we need to remember that Jesus has already won the victory. We need to be watchful. We need to be aware. That's why we seek on this program, and why Eric with the Watchman seeks to make people aware of what's going on behind the headlines. But we do not come from a place of hopelessness. We come to you from a place of hope. The victory's already been won. It doesn't matter what Iran does ultimately. They may indeed introduce nuclear war into this equation. We may at some point experience the catastrophic fallout of such a war. At the same time, it does not change, it does not destroy God's ultimate purpose. He will establish his millennial kingdom on this earth. Jesus' feet will stand on the Mount of Olives victorious.
Amen. And Israel's future is guaranteed. You only have to read the New Testament, the Old Testament to know that. Reagan, it's great to have you back on Behind the Headlines. Really good. And I want to thank you for watching tonight's Behind the Headlines at home. You know, we have to wake up and realise that the Iranian threat is real, the Iranian terror threat is real, and the Iranian nuclear threat is real. And that's why we're called to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, that this current Israeli government has collapsed, and we pray that those in charge would have wisdom to understand and discern the times in which we're living in. But as Christians, we can play a major role by interceding for Israel and praying for the peace of Jerusalem. So thank you for watching tonight's Behind the Headlines.